So the month of Cheshvan has no holidays. So we have to get a little more creative each year when we think about what we're going to study together as we enter this new exciting month. And one of the interesting things, I guess a bit of trivia about the month of Cheshvan, it turns out that this month has a couple of important yard sites worth considering, maybe considering in relation one to the other. So those are the yard site of the Ramban of Nachmanides, the great scholar of 13th century Spain. He died on the 4th of Cheshvan in the year 1270. And much more recently, in our times, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the UK, he passed away on the 20th of Cheshvan in the year 2020. So these are two very different men who lived in two very different times. But I think there's an interesting thread that connects the two of them, and we're going to tease that out a little bit tonight. Here's what I mean. One of the key events of Ramban's life took place towards the end of his life, when he was forced to defend the Jewish faith at a great debate, which we now call, today we would call that the Disputation of Barcelona in the year 1263. So the Ramban was summoned to the royal palace, and he was required to participate in this debate to defend Judaism against the accusations made against our religion by some Christian monks. Okay, so that was in the times of the Ramban. Fast forward to recent times, and Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, well, of course, he was never summoned to the palace to defend Judaism. He was actually invited to the palace by the queen to be knighted. So that was a very different affair. He was knighted and he became Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Baron of Aldgate in the city of London. That was his official title. He sat in the House of Lords. So Rabbi Sacks lived at a very different time. But while he was never summoned for any royal disputations to defend Judaism, Rabbi Sacks did spend a significant part of his career making the case for Judaism, not only to Jews, but to non-Jews as well. In fact, one of Rabbi Sacks's superpowers, you might say, was his ability to confidently argue to the world that Jewish tradition had much to offer in any thoughtful discussion about the consequential questions of our time. And this is something that he argued particularly against those who thought of Judaism as an archaic and outdated way of life, let's say. So you have the Ramban and Rabbi Sacks, again, two very different men living in two very different times, but both found themselves arguing the case of Judaism, but in different circumstances. And maybe this aspect of their lives, the public arguments, the public debates that these two rabbis had about Judaism and its place in the world, so maybe that common theme is a lens through which we can think about how much the position of Jews in society has changed over the centuries, and some of the challenges that we face even today. Okay, so let's start with the Ramban. Let's start with his story. Let's start with the story of this famous Disputation of Barcelona, which was held in July of the year 1263. So Ramban was summoned by King James I of Aragon, who was known as James the Conqueror, at a time when that king was at the height of his royal power. And the disputation was a multi-day affair. The first session was held in the royal palace itself in Barcelona, and there was all kinds of fanfare. We're told that it happened in, quote, the presence of the Lord King of Aragon and many other barons and knights and many Jews. Okay, that's part of the description that we have. And Ramban would have had some idea about what he was walking into, because this was not the first great public disputation between the church and Jews held in the medieval period. This happened a number of times. The first of these famous medieval disputations took place in the royal court of Louis IX of France in the year 1240. So that's about 35 years prior. And in that case, the story was that four great rabbis of the French community, including Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who was one of the Balei Tosfot, he was among this group of four rabbis who were summoned to debate against a formerly Jewish apostate named Nicholas Donin. And the French rabbis were called to defend, in that case, they were called to defend the Talmud against charges that it included blasphemous statements against Jesus and included what the church considered other immoral sentiments. And the rabbis argued before the royal court, they argued and argued, but to no avail. Because this was essentially a show trial against the Talmud. And the decks were stacked against the rabbis. And in the aftermath of that disputation, what happened was 24 cartloads of Hebrew manuscripts were publicly burned. And you have to remember that those were the days before the printing press. So the loss of a library of manuscripts could mean the total destruction of some books, never to be seen or learned ever again. And it certainly meant that for the communities of France, they would lose their ability to learn many of those texts. You couldn't just print off another copy. So that was, in addition to just being a horrible thing to have these books burned, it was just a massively impactful thing. That's what happened at the end of that disputation about 35 years before. And so, given that history, Ramban would certainly have understood what it meant to be called to a public debate by the church. It was not a good thing, but he really had no choice. And Ramban's combatants, you could say, would be a group of Dominican monks. And the lead speaker among the Dominican monks was a man named Pablo Cristiani. And he too was an apostate, born as a Jew in southern France, who converted to Christianity and joined the Dominican order. And this, we know of him as Pablo Cristiani. He's referred by Ramban. Ramban refers to him as Friar Paul. So this man put his Jewish education, you could say, he put his day school education to work, arguing the case of Christianity against Judaism. Now, you might ask, how do we know about the proceedings of this disputation? Okay, how do we know anything about it? So interestingly, there are actually two different sources. One is a brief Latin protocol that recounts how the proceedings went from the Christian point of view. And that version is preserved in the archives of the Crown of Aragon, and there's a second copy, apparently, that's preserved in the Cathedral of the city of Gerona. Okay, so that's kind of the Latin record, a short record of what happened. And then we also have Ramban's own account, far more detailed, which he wrote down about a year and a half after the disputation. And so we have that text where he explains what happened. And the two texts agree on what the topics of the debate were. The debate was focused on three questions. The first was whether the Mashiach had already come, whether the Messiah had come, as Christians believe, or whether he was still to come, as Jews believed. Okay, that's question one. Question two, whether the Messiah was to be both God and man simultaneously, or just a man. That was question two. Question three, whether Jewish practice should still be observed, or whether those practices have been abrogated because the Mashiach has come, okay, or since the coming of the Messiah. So those are the questions, and the terms of the debate were determined by the Dominicans. They decided, interestingly, to use a new type of argument in this debate. The monks would bring a series of sources from the Gemara itself to prove, this was what they argued, that the rabbis of Jesus's time and thereafter actually realized all along that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, this is, as I'm saying it, and as you hear that, this is a very unusual line of attack. It's kind of a crazy argument. Earlier disputations between Christians and Jews typically focused on whether this or that biblical verse foretold the coming of Jesus as Messiah. The Christians would say, here's a verse, and let us show you how it foretells the coming of Jesus. And the rabbis would say, no, you're reading it all wrong. You're not reading the verse properly. And so if you think about it, those kind of debates about the meaning of Scripture actually held some risk for the church, because if the Jewish explanation proved more convincing, more compelling, then that would be a hit to the Christian interpretation of the Bible. In this disputation, the rules were kind of different. The Christian speakers argued that they could prove from Jewish sources, from the Talmud itself, that the sages knew that the Messiah had come, that Jesus was the Messiah. And, again, to a Jewish ear, this sounds entirely crazy. As Ramban himself pointed out, if the rabbis of the Talmud realized that Jesus was Mashiach the Mashiach had come, why did they continue to live out their lives as Jews? Which sounds, sounds to me like a pretty good point. But anyways, and he asked, if the Mashiach has come, why is the world so full of war and violence? Basically, if we're living in messianic times, why does it feel, so not like messianic times? Ramban actually says that he argued as follows, or kind of made the following point. He says, this is a quote from him, he says, the Christians spill more blood than the rest of the nations, and they also lead immoral lives. How difficult it would be for you, my Lord King, and these your knights, if they would not learn war anymore. Anyway, so it gives you a feel when Ramban tells the story of how it went. He kind of comes out punching. Anyways, in any case, the rules of play favored the church, because by framing the debate to be about what the rabbis of the Talmud did or did not believe, there really was no downside for the Christian side. Meaning that if the Ramban could prove that a certain source in the Talmud did not mean what the monks said it meant, there really wasn't any risk of failure for the Christians, because the Talmud had no authority for Christians. At best, the Jews, at best, Ramban could kind of fend off their attacks, but there was no way that he could win. There was no kind of counter proofs or counterattack. And of course, the folks who had set up this disputation weren't looking for a fair fight. The purpose of the disputation was, you could say, as some kind of psychological warfare against the Jews. It was meant to discourage the Jews and to wear them down and to motivate them to, hopefully, from the church's point of view, finally give up and finally convert to Christianity, the one true faith. So, for the most part, the parties in the debate, it seems, were basically talking past each other, right? Seeing things from entirely different perspectives. Each side attempted their own aha moments, their kind of gotcha moments, and neither side came in expecting to be convinced by the other side. This wasn't truly a debate where either side was looking to be convinced. Not surprisingly, this is interesting, both sides claim victory. So the Latin account concludes by saying of Ramban, of Nachmanides, this is a quote, it says, "Thus it is clear that he dares not and cannot defend his erroneous belief." That's how the Latin account ends. In contrast, Ramban relates that at the conclusion of the final session, the king could not help but express admiration for his arguments by exclaiming, and this is a quote from the Ramban, "Never have I seen a man in the wrong plead his case as excellently as you have." Okay, so two different takes on kind of how it went. Anyways, it seems clear that Ramban argued valiantly, but as in the case of the Disputation of Paris, the outcome was predetermined. In the aftermath of the disputation, a series of harsh decrees against the Jews followed. So a week later, the king himself came to the great synagogue of Barcelona to hear Dominican monks give the sermon in shul to the Jewish congregants, like some kind of twisted anti-Jewish drasha that the Jews in shul were forced to sit and listen to. Now, this kind of conversionist sermon by a monk to be given on Shabbat was actually not an unusual occurrence. But you can imagine the presence of the king actually coming to shul to hear it right after the disputation made the level of pressure being exerted upon the Jews feel even greater. And then 3 weeks later, more Jews were ordered to gather to listen to the preaching of Pablo Christiani, that same monk who had just argued with the Ramban. Now the kind of the Jewish community was admonished to come to listen to him, and this is how the church kind of described it. They were told to come meekly, quote, meekly and favorably, and to respond to his queries with, quote, humility and reverence. So that was kind of the setting for their going to hear him come to tell them why their religion was wrong. Anyways, the next thing that happened was that certain Jewish books, including some of the writings of Rambam and others, were ordered to be seized and burned, and Jews were ordered to erase from the Talmud certain passages that Christian censors objected to. Now, it turns out that some of these decrees were later pulled back, or less enlightened over time. But anyways, the message of Jewish powerlessness and subservience was clear, and that's really what the whole affair was about. And then finally, Ramban was forced to flee Spain. So presumably the 300 pieces of gold that the king gave him at the end of the disputation was to help basically pay for some of the costs of his banishment. And what happened was that Ramban fled Spain. Again, as an older, this is in the last years of his life. He fled Spain. He traveled all the way to the land of Israel, where he lived out the last few years of his life. And Ramban lived in the Holy Land in the year 1270, exiled from the land in which he'd grown up and lived most of his life. But in some sense, I guess you could say he kind of finally made it home to the land of Israel, and he dies in the year 1270. Okay, that is the story of the Disputation of Barcelona. Kind of an astonishing, sad story. Okay, contrast all that with a very different debate. A debate that took place in the year 2012 between Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks and Professor Richard Dawkins, who's an evolutionary biologist at Oxford University. Now, Dawkins is an avowed atheist, and you could say he's a public intellectual who enjoys taking on a role, you might say, as public inquisitor against religion. A few years earlier, Dawkins had published a book called The God Delusion, which argued, among other things, that, and here's just a quote to give you a feel, says, here's a quote, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, capriciously malevolent bully." Okay, wow. Anyways, it's tremendous vocabulary to explain how much he dislikes the Old Testament. Okay, so it should be said, it's actually kind of hard to say this after having read that line, but I think it comes across in the debate. I can't say that Dawkins had any particular beef with Judaism. His arguments, for the most part, are against religion in general. His argument was that religion is a backward relic, which morally enfeebles the people who follow it, and which had proven itself to be destructive to society over time. Okay, bigger picture. This was actually part of a broader intellectual current in the early mid 2000s. You may remember that at the time, a number of staunch atheists kind of made their case publicly against the evils of religion. And there were a bunch of books that were published in rapid fire during that period. So those included a book called The End of Faith by American writer and podcaster Sam Harris, a book called God is Not Great by the British author Christopher Hitchens. This was all the rage at the time. It was trendy. Okay, it was trendy for atheists to argue publicly against religion. That was having, you could say, a pop culture moment. And it was in response to all that, basically as a response to these evangelists of anti-religious atheism, which actually this group kind of had a title. They came to be called the new atheism. So in response to all that, Rabbi Sacks wrote a book in the year 2011 called The Great Partnership: Science, Religion, and the Search for Meaning. And this was Rabbi Sacks writing not as chief rabbi, but as a public intellectual, defending faith in general. So not just as chief rabbi of the Jewish community of the UK, but he was really speaking as a public intellectual defending faith. And so, as a follow-on to the publishing of that book, in the year 2012, Rabbi Sacks and this professor, Richard Dawkins, sat across from each other. There was a moderator. They were all sitting on stage at something called the Religions and Ethics Festival, which was put on by the BBC. And you could say that this was a public disputation of sorts. The rabbi defending his faith against a hostile outside attacker. But very clearly, this was quite a different setup than Ramban's disputation in Barcelona some 700 years before. Rabbi Sacks was operating in a very different world. So just to spell that out. So Ramban in the 1200s was summoned by the king against his will. Rabbi Sacks, on the other hand, was a member of the House of Lords. Rabbi Sacks was in no way compelled to be there. In fact, it was an opportunity for him. And the tone of the debate was also very different than a medieval disputation. It was more of a thoughtful conversation where there seemed to be a sense of respect between the two men, rather than feeling like an inquisition. It's actually interesting. It's all on the internet. You can listen to it. It was clear that they disagreed on the merits, but it didn't seem to be, again, it had the feeling of a conversation despite all that. And importantly, Rabbi Sachs was in no danger of being banished from the UK if he lost the debate. And after the initial discussion, there's a Q&A session that follows. And the questions are actually addressed to both speakers. The Q&A doesn't give the sense that the crowd was clamoring for just one side. And also interestingly, Rabbi Sachs throughout is really on the offensive most of the time, and he's given the last word. So if this was a modern disputation, it was quite a different thing. But in some sense, the biggest difference between the two disputations was this. Rabbi Sachs was defending not just Judaism against a hostile Christian court, right? That's what Ramban had to do. Really, Rabbi Sachs was up on stage defending religion in general, Judaism, of course, but also in some sense, all religion against a broadside attack from people arguing that religion in general is outdated and at best something that had its day, but maybe not even that. They would, these folks would say that religion was essentially archaic and immoral. And so the competitor in this modern debate was not another religion, but anti-religion. And many of the arguments that Rabbi Sachs made were not specific to Judaism. For example, he made a practical argument for the importance of membership in a faith community. He argued that moral ideas alone, like moral philosophy alone, isn't enough to motivate people. Rather, Rabbi Sachs argued that people need to be part of a faith community that rehearses and reinforces moral ideas and incorporates them into people's actual lives. And that pushes people to put moral ideas into practice. Okay, so in some sense, Rabbi Sachs was up on stage defending the concept of faith and of a faith community. Again, not just defending his own faith of Judaism. And yet, as you listen to him speak, it's just so clear that Rabbi Sachs is coming from a specifically Jewish perspective. He cites Jewish sources when confronted with certain extreme fundamentalist religious viewpoints, which are taken to be arguments against religion. Rabbi Sachs sometimes answered by saying something along the lines of, hey, don't blame us for that particular bad religious idea. That's what some other people think. Okay, Jews don't buy into that and never have. And further, more than that, we Jews have often been victims of that kind of religious fundamentalism at the hands of others for millennia. So here's Rabbi Sachs arguing the case of religion in general, disputing the claims of this anti-religious antagonist, but very much from a uniquely Jewish perspective. Here was Rabbi Sachs in a modern disputation, but again, a very different one than Jews had faced in the past. And when you think about it, the role of Rabbi Sachs as a public intellectual, as a defender of faith in general, is just extraordinary. So here's, like, to put it in perspective, Rabbi Sachs was the author of 43 books. And many of his books, of course, are only targeted at Jews, not targeted, there are different books that he wrote. Some of them are more targeted Jews only, but many of them were really for a broader readership. So just to rattle off some of the titles of books that he wrote: Faith in the Future, Celebrating Life, The Persistence of Faith, The Dignity of Difference, To Heal a Fractured World, The Politics of Hope, Morality. It's just, just hearing the titles of these, okay? These are books about society at large, and often they incorporate an argument about the positive role that religion has to play in any ethical society. And we should say that Rabbi Sachs was not himself proselytizing. He wasn't trying to argue who's right on the question of religious dogma, but he was pushing unyieldingly for Judaism to be part of the public conversation. He was arguing that Jewish wisdom and tradition had important messages for the world, for everyone. And the truth is that Rabbi Sachs was really calling for a conversation between religion and what you might call non-religion. And conversation between those two is very different than debate or disputation. So here's a way that Rabbi Sachs put it himself in his book, The Dignity of Difference. So here's a quote. He says, in a debate, one side wins, the other loses, but both are the same as they were before. In a conversation, neither side loses and both are changed because they now know what reality looks like from a different perspective. That is not to say that either gives up its previous convictions. That is not what conversation is about. It does mean, however, that I may now realize that I must make space for another deeply held belief. And if my own case has been compelling, the other side may understand that it too must make space for mine. Okay, end quote. So this is not a debate that you win by defeating the other side, but the goal of the conversation is to win space for yourself as a recognized and respected voice fully at the table in your society. That's what Rabbi Sacks was arguing for. And so much of Rabbi Sacks's role as a public intellectual was to speak in a Jewish voice that others could understand, in a confident, positive Jewish voice, not to prove that Judaism was right, but to show that Judaism was wise. And you could say that that's in keeping with a line that we read in Parshat V'Chanan, which goes as follows. It says, Ushmartem vasitem ki hi chochmatchem uvinatchem le'nei ha'amim. Observe the mitzvot faithfully, for that will be proof of your wisdom and discernment to other people. Asher yishma'un et kol hachukim ha'ele ve'yomru, because they will hear of your laws, and they will say, Rak am chacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh. Surely this great nation must be a wise and discerning people. Okay, so I'm going to leave off with that. In the month ahead, let's exercise that kind of wisdom. Let's keep in mind how far we've come, and of course, how much more work we have ahead of us. Okay, should be a good month for all of us.